The plane hummed quietly as passengers settled into their seats. But for Sergeant Amara Davis, the flight home was already more complicated than she had anticipated. Dressed in her faded olive-green uniform, she sat silently in first class, a seat she hadn't expected but was grateful for. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit rose abruptly, his face twisted with indignation. "You don't belong here," he said sharply, his words cutting through the quiet cabin. Amara stayed calm, showing him her ticket, but his words lingered like a sting. The other passengers watched, some curious, others avoiding her gaze. She thought about switching seats just to avoid further confrontation, but then something inside her refused. Instead, she reached for a notepad, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrote a note that would change the tone of the entire flight. By the time they landed, the man who had tried to humiliate her would approach her, not with disdain, but with humility, holding that same note in his hands. What did she write that turned prejudice into reflection? Watch to find out. Sergeant Amara Davis stepped off the shuttle bus, her boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud as she adjusted the strap of her heavy duffel bag. The weight of the bag was a familiar companion, though nowhere near as heavy as the memories and emotions she carried within. She paused for a moment, taking in the chaotic energy of the airport. After months of deployment in a foreign land, the civilian world felt almost alien, a stark contrast to the rigid order and constant danger she had grown accustomed to. Yet, the thought of being home, of seeing her family, was a small light cutting through the fog of her exhaustion. The airport terminal buzzed with life, its halls filled with hurried footsteps, snippets of conversations, and the occasional laughter of children. Business travelers in suits and polished shoes rolled sleek carry-ons behind them, their eyes fixed on departure boards or phone screens. Vacationers, clad in casual wear and carrying brightly colored luggage, moved with the energy of anticipation. In the middle of this whirlwind, Amara stood out, not just because of her uniform, worn and faded from countless missions, but because of her composed, almost stoic presence. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't checking her phone. She simply moved forward, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Her olive-green uniform bore the marks of her service, scuffs from rugged terrain, frayed edges from long nights in hostile environments, and a faded name patch that had been stitched and restitched over the years. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed unremarkable, but to Amara, every thread told a story. She adjusted her grip on the duffel bag, its familiar weight pressing into her shoulder, a physical reminder of her experiences overseas. The bag held the few belongings she had managed to carry through her deployment. Spare uniforms, a journal filled with hastily scribbled thoughts, and mementos from comrades who had become like family. Her face, though youthful, bore lines that spoke of sleepless nights, countless decisions under pressure, and the silent toll of loss. The kind of loss that doesn't fade, but settles deep, becoming part of who you are. Her brown eyes, steady and observant, carried a depth that belied her age. They had seen too much, joy and pain, courage and fear, quiet determination that had kept her going through the hardest days. As she navigated the terminal, her senses were overwhelmed by the sights and sounds. The polished floors reflected the glow of overhead lights, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of jet fuel. Announcements crackled over the intercom, calling passengers to gates or informing them of delays. Amara tuned it all out, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of home. She could almost hear her mother's voice, filled with equal parts relief and joy, welcoming her back. She imagined her younger brother's wide grin as he ran to hug her, peppering her with questions about her time away. Despite her exhaustion, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Home. It was a word that had kept her going during long nights under starless skies, through missions that seemed endless, and in moments when fear threatened to consume her. It was the promise of familiarity, of comfort, of love. But it was also bittersweet. The last time she had come home, she had been greeted with similar smiles, but she had also felt the weight of questions she couldn't answer, stories she couldn't fully share. This time, she wasn't sure if she'd even try. As she approached the check-in counter, the airline staff greeted her with polite smiles. Her uniform often drew a mix of reactions. Some people offered genuine gratitude for her service, while others seemed indifferent or even uncomfortable. Today, the clerk behind the desk seemed kind. She thanked Amara for her service and processed her ticket with quiet efficiency. Amara didn't notice the small gesture at first, but when she glanced down at her boarding pass, she saw the seat assignment, 3A, first class. She frowned slightly. I'm sure if it was a mistake, but the clerk simply smiled and nodded as if to say, "You've earned it." Amara wasn't used to special treatment. The military had instilled in her a sense of humility, a belief that everyone on the team was equal, regardless of rank or role. First class felt foreign. She had spent years in cramped barracks, sharing space with others, and more flights than she could count in the back of military cargo planes. The idea of sitting in a plush seat, with extra legroom and perhaps even a warm meal, felt almost wrong. But the thought of rest, real rest, was too tempting to pass up. She tucked the boarding pass into her pocket and made her way toward security. The line moved slowly, giving her time to observe the people around her. A couple ahead of her exchanged quiet words, their hands intertwined. A child behind her whined about having to take off their shoes, their parents sighing in exasperation. Amara couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy for their normalcy. She had been part of a world so far removed from this one, and it felt like stepping into another dimension. The laughter, the impatience, the small inconveniences, these were luxuries she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. When she finally reached the gate, the boarding area was already filling with passengers. Groups clustered around, chatting or staring at their phones. Amara found a quiet corner to sit, setting her duffel bag down with a soft thud. She leaned back in her chair, letting her head rest against the wall, and closed her eyes for a moment. The hum of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter faded into the background as her mind drifted. She thought about her deployment, the heat, the dust, the constant vigilance. She remembered the friends she had made, the bonds forged in the crucible of shared hardship. She also remembered the ones who hadn't made it back, their absence a constant ache that she carried with her. Each name, each face was etched into her memory, a reminder of the cost of service. She had written letters to their families, trying to find the right words to honor their sacrifices, but nothing ever felt adequate. Her thoughts were interrupted by the boarding announcement. Passengers in first class were called first, and Amara hesitated for a moment before standing. She felt the weight of eyes on her as she joined the line, a soldier in a sea of suits and designer clothes. Some passengers glanced at her with curiosity, others with indifference. She ignored them, focusing instead on the promise of the seat waiting for her. As she stepped onto the plane, the flight attendants greeted her warmly. One of them noticed her uniform and offered a sincere thank you for your service, which Amara acknowledged with a polite nod. She found her seat easily, near the front of the cabin, and set her duffel bag in the overhead compartment before settling in. The plush seat felt almost surreal, a stark contrast to the rigid chairs she was used to. She leaned back, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. For the first time in months, she felt like she could finally breathe. Little did she know this flight would be anything but peaceful. The boarding line inched forward, and Amara found herself stepping into the narrow jet bridge, the dull hum of the plane's engines growing louder with each step. The cool, recycled air inside the cabin greeted her as she crossed the threshold, where a smiling flight attendant nodded warmly. Amara returned the gesture with a polite smile of her own, keeping her focus on her ticket and the seat number printed in bold, 3A. Navigating the first-class cabin, she immediately noticed the contrast. The passengers were impeccably dressed, tailored suits, silk blouses, polished shoes. A man in a blazer chatted on a sleek phone, his voice low and confident, while a woman nearby adjusted her designer handbag beneath her seat. Amara felt their glances linger on her for a moment, curious and perhaps judgmental. She couldn't help but feel out of place in her olive green uniform, its fabric worn and frayed from the trials of deployment. This world was one she had never belonged to, and she wasn't sure she ever wanted to. Reaching her assigned seat, she carefully placed her duffel bag in the overhead compartment, the strain in her shoulder easing as she let it go. Lowering herself into the plush leather seat, she ran her hand over the armrest, feeling its smooth surface. It was a small luxury, but after months of hard, unforgiving conditions, it felt monumental. Amara exhaled slowly, a sense of gratitude washing over her. She didn't know why she had been given this seat, but for once she decided not to question the kindness. Just as she began to relax, letting her body settle into the unfamiliar comfort, a shadow fell across her. She looked up to see a man standing in the aisle, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief. He was well dressed, his tailored suit and gleaming watch a picture of wealth and confidence. But there was something in his eyes, a hardness, a quiet disdain, that set her on edge. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharp and clipped. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Amara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm sorry," she replied, her voice calm but puzzled. The man crossed his arms, his posture stiff with impatience. "This is my seat, 3A. You must be mistaken. Amara glanced down at her ticket, her heart sinking slightly, even as she knew she was in the right. "You're a soldier. You should be in coach, not first class." The words hit her like a slap, a familiar sting she had felt too many times before. Prejudice was nothing new to her, but it never ceased to hurt, no matter how often she encountered it. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain composed. I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady, though her hands tightened into fists in her lap. "But this is the seat that was assigned to me." The man's expression hardened further, his voice lowering but losing none of its venom. "Unbelievable," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You don't belong here." Amara felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavy and suffocating. The other passengers had begun to notice the exchange, their gazes flickering toward her, some curious, others wary. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer effort it took to keep her emotions in check. All she wanted was to get through the flight in peace, to rest and recharge for the journey ahead. But this man, this stranger, it was intent on making her presence in first class an issue. "I think you're mistaken," she said again, her tone firm but measured. She wanted to stand her ground, to assert her right to be there, but the scrutiny of the other passengers made her feel exposed, vulnerable. For a brief moment, she considered offering to switch seats, just to avoid further confrontation, but something in her resisted. She had earned this. She didn't need to justify herself to anyone, least of all a man who saw her uniform and assumed she was less deserving. The man opened his mouth to speak again, his face contorted with indignation, but before he could say another word, a flight attendant appeared. Amara sighed. Her presence was calm but commanding, her professional smile hinting at an unspoken authority. "Is there a problem here?" the flight attendant asked, her eyes shifting between the man and Amara. The man straightened, gesturing toward Amara, as though presenting evidence in a trial. "Yes, there is. This is my seat," he said, his tone dripping with exasperation. "I don't know why she's here, but she doesn't belong in first class." The flight attendant's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened ever so slightly. She turned to Amara, glancing at the ticket still clutched in her hand. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Amara handed it over silently, her heart pounding as she watched the attendant scan the details. After a brief moment, she looked up, her smile returning, this time with a touch of warmth. "Sergeant Davis," she said, her voice firm but kind, "your seat is indeed 3A. Thank you for your service." She turned to the man, her professional demeanor unshaken. "Sir, your seat is in 5A, just a couple of rows back." The man's face turned a deep shade of red, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for a retort. Finally, he let out a huff of frustration, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off toward his assigned seat. The flight attendant nodded to Amara, handing back her ticket with a reassuring smile. Amara murmured a quiet thank you, her voice barely above a whisper, and sank back into her seat. The confrontation was over, but the tension lingered, a knot in her chest that refused to loosen. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, some lingering with curiosity, others quickly averting their gaze. She turned her head toward the window, letting the low hum of the engines fill the silence. Her hands rested in her lap, still trembling slightly as she replayed the man's words in her mind. "You don't belong here." They echoed, sharp and cutting, a reminder of the battles she fought not just overseas, but in moments like these, on planes, in stores, in everyday encounters where she was seen as less, as undeserving. As the flight attendant moved down the aisle, Amara took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of the exchange. She had faced far worse in her life, challenges that had tested her strength, her resilience, her very sense of self. But no matter how strong she was, the sting of prejudice always found a way to pierce through. Mark's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the first-class cabin, rising in volume with each word, as if amplifying his indignation would validate his claims. "This is ridiculous. There's no way this is right," he said, gesturing wildly toward Amara, as though she were some sort of intruder. The crispness of his tailored suit and the confident arrogance he carried seemed only to magnify the disdain in his voice. Amara remained seated, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face betrayed no emotion, but inside she felt the familiar churn of humiliation and anger. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers bearing into her, a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and silent judgment. She kept her gaze focused ahead, refusing to meet their stares, her calm demeanor a mask that hid the sting of the man's words. "I've flown enough times to know how this works," Mark continued, his voice growing sharper. "They don't just put anyone in first class, let alone someone who—" He paused, glancing pointedly at her uniform. "Clearly doesn't belong here." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their sideways glances flitting between Mark and Amara. Some whispered quietly to one another, their voices too low to be heard, but their expressions speaking volumes. Others sat frozen, unwilling to get involved but unable to look away from the unfolding scene. Amara felt her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of how exposed she was in that moment. Before she could muster a response, the flight attendant returned, her professional smile still in place, but her eyes now carrying a distinct firmness. "Sir," she began, her voice calm yet authoritative, "we've already confirmed that Sergeant Davis is assigned to this seat." Mark turned toward the flight attendant, his irritation shifting from Amara to this new obstacle in his path. "I don't care what her ticket says. She's in the wrong place," he said, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Look at her. This doesn't make sense." The attendant's expression didn't waver. She had likely encountered passengers like Mark before, those who believed that the world bent to their will. "Sir, your seat is in 5A, she repeated, her voice steady. "This is 3A, and it belongs to Sergeant Davis. Please take your assigned seat so we can prepare for takeoff." For a moment, Mark seemed as though he might argue further, his mouth opening as if to unleash another tirade. But the flight attendant's unwavering demeanor gave him pause. He glanced around, taking in the watchful eyes of the other passengers, their silent judgment now turned on him. His face flushed red with frustration and embarrassment. With a sharp exhale, he muttered something unintelligible under his breath and grabbed his carry-on from the aisle. "This is unbelievable," he grumbled, as he made his way toward the back of the first-class cabin, his retreat punctuated by the quiet hum of engines and the rustle of passengers settling back into their seats. Amara didn't turn to watch him leave. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, the faint reflection of her face in the glass, a quiet reminder of her restraint. The flight attendant turned to Amara, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry for the disturbance, Sergeant Davis," she said gently. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Amara nodded, offering a quiet "thank you," before the attendant moved on to assist another passenger. The cabin gradually returned to its usual rhythm, the murmurs of conversation and the rustle of papers filling the space left by the confrontation. But for Amara, the tension lingered like a cloud she couldn't quite shake. She leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her fingers still trembling slightly from the encounter. She let her eyes drift to the window, the faint lines of the runway visible in the distance. The thought of the journey ahead, a few short hours separating her from the embrace of her family, offered a sliver of comfort. But the man's words echoed in her mind, sharp and cutting. "You don't belong here." It wasn't the first time she had heard those words, or words like them. She had encountered prejudice in many forms, from subtle glances to outright hostility, both in and out of uniform. Each time, it felt like a wound reopening, a reminder of the barriers she faced, even as she dedicated her life to serving her country. She had trained herself to rise above it, to carry herself with dignity and composure. But moments like this always left a mark, no matter how strong her resolve. As the plane began to taxi, Amara closed her eyes, letting the low hum of the engines fill the space in her mind. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't let this moment define her journey. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let the prejudice of one man overshadow the pride she felt in her service and the anticipation of reuniting with her family. Still, the frustration lingered, a weight she would carry with her at least for a little while longer. As the plane lifted off the ground, Amara felt the subtle shift in pressure and the familiar weightlessness that came with takeoff. She watched the world shrink beneath her, the patchwork of streets and buildings fading into the clouds. It was a view she had seen countless times during her service, but this time it carried a different meaning. This flight was supposed to mark the end of months of hardship, the beginning of a return to normalcy. Yet the interaction with Mark lingered in her mind, clouding what should have been a moment of quiet relief. She leaned back in her seat, letting her head rest against the cushion. Her eyes closed, though she wasn't sleeping. Her thoughts drifted, pulling her into the familiar terrain of memories. Some she cherished, others she wished she could forget. The faces of her fellow soldiers came to her first, their smiles and laughter echoing in her mind. They had been her family in every way that mattered, bonded by shared trials and unspoken understanding. Yet not all of them had made it back. The weight of their absence settled heavily in her chest, a grief she carried silently. Amara thought of the nights spent under foreign skies, where the stars seemed dimmer and the air carried the weight of uncertainty. She remembered the relentless rhythm of duty, the long hours, and the moments of fear she couldn't show. It had all become a part of her, shaping her into the person she was now. She was proud of her service, proud of what she had endured and overcome. But that pride was often tempered by the reality of how the world saw her. Wearing the uniform didn't shield her from prejudice. If anything, it made her more of a target in some people's eyes. Mark's words played in her mind, sharp and cutting. "You don't belong here." It wasn't the first time she had faced such judgment, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She had lost count of how many times people had looked at her and made assumptions about her worth, her capabilities, her place in the world. Even as she risked her life for her country, there were still those who saw her as less. It was a bitter reality, one she had learned to navigate with quiet strength, but it didn't make the sting any less potent. Opening her eyes, Amara glanced around the cabin. The other passengers had returned to their conversations, their newspapers, their in-flight entertainment. All except one. Mark was seated a few rows behind her, his face partially obscured by the seat back in front of him, but she could feel his gaze. He wasn't staring outright, but his glances were unmistakable, quick, assessing, filled with the same disdain he had shown during their earlier contrifidation. It unsettled her, though she tried not to let it show. She had faced far worse than a disapproving look, yet something about his presence gnawed at her. Perhaps it was the audacity of it, the way he seemed so unapologetically bothered by her existence in a space he deemed his own. Or perhaps it was the weariness that came from years of dealing with people like him, the kind of people who couldn't see past their own biases to recognize shared humanity. Amara took a slow, steadying breath, her fingers gripping the armrests for a moment before relaxing. She couldn't let him take up space in her mind, not when she had already given him so much of her energy. But as much as she tried to dismiss it, the weight of the encounter lingered. It wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. The countless voices, the countless glances, the countless moments that had reminded her she was different, that her presence was questioned, that her worth was judged. She couldn't let it end this way. Amara wasn't one to let a single moment define her, and she certainly wasn't going to let someone like Mark have the final word. Her hand moved instinctively to her bag, pulling out a small notepad and pen. She flipped it open, the blank page staring back at her, inviting her to fill it with the thoughts swirling in her mind. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. It was about saying what needed to be said even if it wasn't heard in the way she intended. With a steady hand, she began to write, her words flowing onto the page with purpose. Amara stared at the blank page for a moment, the pen hovering just above it. She could still feel the weight of Mark's gaze, his earlier words replaying in her mind. "You don't belong here." It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the tone, the certainty, the assumption that she could be judged and dismissed so easily. She exhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a brief moment before putting pen to paper. She began to write, her hand steady as the words formed on the page. She didn't want to respond with anger. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she chose honesty, drawing from the experiences that had shaped her and the values that had guided her through the hardest moments of her life. The words came easily, a reflection of the thoughts she had carried silently for years. "Dear Sir, I understand that there was a misunderstanding earlier, and I wanted to take a moment to address it. My name is Sergeant Amara Davis, and I am proud to serve this country. My uniform represents not just me, but the sacrifices of countless others who have fought for the freedoms we all enjoy. I've seen firsthand the cost of those freedoms, the lives lost, the families changed forever, the bonds forged in the crucible of service. I carry the memories of those who didn't make it home, their laughter, their courage, and their absence. It is a weight I bear willingly, because I believe in what this uniform stands for. But moments like today remind me that the battles we fight are not always on distant shores. Sometimes they are right here, in the assumptions we make about one another, in the walls we build that divide us. I hope that one day we can see past those divisions and recognize what unites us, our shared humanity. We are more alike than we are different, and kindness is something we can all afford to show. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I hope it gives you a moment to reflect, as it did for me while writing it." Amara paused, rereading the note. It was simple but honest, a reflection of the person she strived to be. Folding the paper neatly, she slipped it into her hand and called the flight attendant over with a quiet gesture. The attendant, who had been so understanding earlier, approached with a kind smile. "I'd like you to deliver this to the gentleman in 5A, Amara said softly, handing her the note. The flight attendant took it without hesitation, her expression warm with encouragement. "Of course, Sergeant Davis," she replied, before making her way down the aisle. Amara watched as the note changed hands, feeling a flicker of nervousness mixed with resolve. This wasn't about an apology or an argument. It was about extending a hand, however small, toward understanding. Mark's reaction was immediate. He looked at the folded paper with a mix of confusion and suspicion before carefully unfolding it. Amara couldn't see his face clearly from her seat, but she watched the tension in his posture shift as his eyes scanned the page. His expression softened, the hard lines of his frown melting into something more complex, something thoughtful. He read the note again and then again, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper as though it might offer answers to questions he hadn't yet asked himself. Amara turned her gaze back to the window, letting the moment be his to process. She didn't expect a response. She didn't need one. Writing the note had been as much for her as it was for him, a way to reclaim her dignity and assert her humanity in the face of his prejudice. For the rest of the flight, Mark didn't look in her direction. His head remained bowed, his hands resting on the folded note in his lap. Amara couldn't be sure what he was thinking, but she allowed herself to hope that her words had reached him, even if only a little. The silence that followed felt different, no longer heavy with tension, but with the possibility of reflection and perhaps understanding. As the plane descended, the hum of the engines shifted to a softer, steadier rhythm. Amara adjusted her seatbelt, her thoughts drifting between the anticipation of finally reuniting with her family, and the lingering unease from earlier. Ever impact her words might have had, it wasn't something she could control. She had done her part, and that was enough. The seatbelt sign chimed, and the flight attendants began their final preparations for landing. Amara leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the shrinking horizon outside the window. The sprawling city below came into view, its lights glittering like scattered stars against the fading daylight. She was ready to leave this moment behind. Home. Kim. But as the plane touched down with a slight jolt and began its slow taxi to the gate, a shadow moved in her peripheral vision. She turned to see Mark, standing in the aisle beside her, his expression markedly different from the one he had worn earlier. The arrogance and indignation were gone, replaced by something softer, almost hesitant at his sides, one of them clutching the note she had written. "Sergeant Davis," he began, his voice quieter than she had expected, "I wanted to speak with you before we got off the plane." Amara regarded him calmly, her expression neutral but not unkind. She waited, giving him the space to find his words. I owe you an apology," he said, his gaze faltering for a moment before meeting hers again. "I was out of line earlier, completely out of line. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and ignorant. I let my own biases get the better of me." His voice caught slightly on the last words, and Amara could see the genuine affection he was feeling. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," she said. "Thank you for saying that." Mark looked down at the note in his hand, his fingers smoothing its folded edges. "Your note," he said, his tone softening further. It made me think a lot about myself, about the way I see people. I realized how wrong I was to judge you, especially without knowing anything about you." He paused, his lips pressing into a thin line, as though he was wrestling with something deeper. Finally, he continued, his voice tinged with emotion. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan a few years ago. He was a soldier too. I think seeing you in uniform brought up a lot of feelings I wasn't prepared to deal with, but that's no excuse for how I treated you." Amara's expression shifted, her gaze softening as she turned to face him. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely, her voice quiet but filled with empathy. "Losing someone in the line of duty is a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone." Mark nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think I've been carrying a lot of anger about it, and I didn't even realize it until today. Your note, it reminded me of something I've been trying to ignore, that we're all connected, even in ways we don't see at first." Amara offered him a small, understanding smile. "That connection is what keeps us going," she said. "It's what makes the sacrifices worth it. We're all in this together, even when it doesn't feel like it." Mark exhaled deeply, as though letting go of a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice steadying. "Not just for your service, but for your patience, for giving me a chance to see things differently." Amara extended her hand, and Mark took it without hesitation. Thank you for being willing to reflect, she said. That takes strength, too. As the passengers began to disembark, Mark lingered for a moment, his expression thoughtful. If there's ever anything I can do to repay the kindness you've shown me, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Amara accepted the card, tucking it into her jacket pocket with a nod. Take care of yourself, Mark, she said, her tone warm but resolute. And take care of others, too. Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked down the aisle. Amara watched him go, her thoughts briefly lingering on their exchange. It wasn't often that moments like this ended with understanding, with the possibility of change. She allowed herself to feel a small sense of peace as she gathered her bag and stepped off the plane, ready to face what came next. As the passengers began filing out of the plane, a soft hum of conversation filled the cabin. Amara stood, hoisting her duffel bag onto her shoulder with practiced ease. She felt the usual heaviness of its weight, though it seemed lighter now, as if the confrontation earlier had dissipated some of the tension she'd been carrying. She stepped into the aisle, ready to join the flow of passengers disembarking, when Mark approached her once again. He looked different now, less composed, less polished, but more genuine. There was no trace of the haughty entitlement that had defined his presence earlier. Instead, his posture was open, his face etched with sincerity. In his hand he still clutched the note she had written, now creased and worn from being folded and unfolded. "Sergeant Davis," he began, his voice steady but soft. Amara turned to face him, her expression neutral yet attentive. "Before we leave, I just want to say one more thing." She nodded, giving him the space to continue. "Thank you," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "Thank you for your service, for everything you've done for this country, and for the patience you showed me today. You had every reason to walk away or respond with anger, but you didn't. Instead, you taught me something I won't forget." Amara regarded him quietly for a moment before replying. "It's not easy to confront our own biases," she said. "But you took the first step. That matters." Mark nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line as he reached into his pocket. "If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out," he said, handing her a business card. His name and contact information were neatly printed in bold letters, alongside a title that indicated his role in a prominent law firm. "It's the least I can do after today." Amara took the card, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. She glanced at it briefly before slipping it into her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone warm. "And thank you for being honest. That takes courage, too." Mark hesitated for a moment, as though searching for the right words to end the conversation. Finally, he extended his hand. "Take care of yourself," he said. Amara accepted the handshake, her grip firm but kind. "You too," she replied. "And take care of others. That's where the real work begins." With a nod of understanding, Mark turned and joined the line of passengers heading toward the terminal. Amara watched him go, his figure blending into the crowd as he disappeared from view. She lingered for a moment, her thoughts turning inward as she adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and made her way off the plane. The terminal was bustling with life, families reuniting with hugs and laughter, travelers hurrying to their next connections, the steady hum of announcements filling the air. Amara moved through it all with a quiet ease, her presence calm amidst the chaos. She was ready to leave the confrontation behind, but it wasn't something she could easily forget. As she walked toward the exit, her mind replayed the events of the flight, Mark's words, his eventual apology, and the shift in his demeanor stayed with her. It wasn't every day that someone confronted their own prejudices so openly, let alone expressed genuine remorse. It reminded her that people had the capacity to change, even when it seemed unlikely. The walls that divided them weren't unbreakable. Sometimes all it took was a moment of reflection, a willingness to see someone not as an other but as a fellow human being. She thought about the notes she had written, the words she had chosen so carefully. They had come from a place of vulnerability and strength, a balance she had learned to navigate over years of service and sacrifice. It hadn't been about changing Mark or forcing him to see the world her way. It had been about speaking her truth and trusting that it might plant a seed of understanding. Whether that seed would grow was beyond her control, but she allowed herself to hope. As the automatic doors slid open and the cool evening air hit her face, Amara felt a sense of renewal. The world was far from perfect, and the challenges she faced as a black woman in uniform wouldn't vanish overnight. But moments like this reminded her that progress was possible, even in small, unexpected ways. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Amara adjusted her grip on the duffel bag and stepped out into the night, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The journey home had been marked by conflict, but it ended with understanding, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet power of connection. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace, ready to embrace whatever came next. As Sergeant Amara Davis stepped into the cool evening air, leaving the airport behind, she carried with her more than just her duffel bag. The journey home had been filled with unexpected challenges, but it had also been a journey of growth, not just for her, but for someone else. Mark Williams, a man who had started as a stranger filled with prejudice and left as someone willing to reflect and change. It was a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there is room for connection, understanding, and hope. Stories like this remind us of the profound impact we can have on each other, even in situations that seem small or fleeting. Amara's decision to act with patience and empathy, even when faced with judgment, created a ripple effect. Her words in that simple note reached beyond the surface, challenging Mark to confront his own biases and inspiring him to see her not as an outsider, but as a fellow human being. It wasn't just about resolving a disagreement. It was about fostering a moment of transformation, one that, though brief, had the potential to create lasting change. This story isn't just about Amara and Mark. It's about all of us. It's about the opportunities we encounter every day to bridge the gaps that divide us. How often do we find ourselves in situations where assumptions and judgments cloud our ability to truly see one another? And how often do we let those moments pass by, choosing silence over understanding or retreat over connection? Amara's story challenges us to think differently. It reminds us that no matter how wide the gap may seem, it can always be crossed, sometimes with something as simple as a heartfelt note or a few honest words. Have you ever experienced a moment like this? A moment where you or someone else took a step toward understanding, even in the face of conflict or discomfort? Maybe it was a conversation that changed your perspective, or an unexpected act of kindness that opened your heart. Maybe it was something you did, an effort to reach out, to listen, or to see beyond the surface. These moments are powerful, not because they solve all the world's problems, but because they show us what's possible when we choose connection over division. Take a moment to reflect on your own experiences. Was there ever a time when you were like Mark, caught in a web of assumptions or prejudice, only to have your perspective shifted by someone else's courage or kindness? Or perhaps you were like Amara, finding the strength to respond with grace in a moment when judgment could have easily been met with anger. These stories matter. They remind us of our shared humanity, of the ways we are more alike than we are different. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice could be the spark that encourages someone else to reflect, to connect, or to take that first step toward understanding. Imagine the ripple effect that can happen when we share these moments, when we choose to talk about respect, empathy, and the courage it takes to see each other as equals. Together, we can create a space where stories like this inspire action and understanding. Mark's journey in this story is one that mirrors the experiences of many. Prejudice is often rooted in pain, fear, or misunderstanding, and it takes courage to confront those feelings. Mark's loss of his brother in Afghanistan colored his view of the world, leading him to act out of anger and bias. But it also showed us that people are capable of change when given the chance. His willingness to reflect and apologize was a testament to the power of humility and self-awareness. At the same time, Amara's decision to act with patience and compassion was just as powerful. She could have responded with anger or chosen to ignore Mark entirely, but instead she wrote that note. A simple gesture that carried the weight of her experiences, her values, and her hope for a better future. In doing so, she reminded us that kindness is not a weakness. It is a strength, one that can break down even the most stubborn walls. This story also highlights the everyday nature of these moments. They don't always happen in dramatic settings or involve grand gestures. Sometimes they occur in the most ordinary places: a flight, a workplace, a neighborhood. And yet, their impact can be extraordinary. They remind us that change doesn't always require sweeping actions. It starts with small, intentional choices. A kind word, a thoughtful question, a willingness to listen. As you reflect on this story, consider the ways you can create those moments in your own life. How can you be the person who bridges the gap, who sees beyond the surface, who chooses understanding over judgment? It doesn't have to be a big act. Sometimes the smallest gestures can have the greatest impact. If you've had an experience like this, we'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else to think differently, to reach out, or to take a step toward connection. And if you haven't had such a moment yet, consider this an invitation to create one. Look for opportunities to challenge your assumptions, to extend kindness, and to see others for who they truly are. This story is also a call to action. If you believe in the power of respect and understanding, show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others. Let's create a conversation about these moments, about the ways we can build bridges instead of walls. The more we talk about it, the more we can inspire change. One story, one connection, one step at a time. As Amara walked out of the airport, she carried with her a renewed sense of hope. The journey had been marked by conflict, but it ended with understanding, a reminder that even the smallest actions can lead to meaningful change. And that is the challenge she leaves us with, to take those moments when they come, to choose kindness, and to recognize the humanity in everyone we meet. The world isn't perfect, and the road to understanding is rarely easy. But stories like Amara's show us that it's possible. They remind us that even in moments of division, there is a chance for connection, and that chance is always worth taking.